The USS Eldridge was a cannon-class destroyer escort, one of dozens built during World War II for a single purpose: hunting German submarines. Launched in July 1943, she measured 306 feet long and carried a crew of roughly 200 men. Nothing in her design or her orders set her apart from any other warship in the fleet. She was ordinary in every way. But 12 years after the war ended, a claim would surface that transformed this unremarkable vessel into one of the most debated ships in military history. According to the story, the United States Navy had conducted a secret experiment aboard the Eldridge, one that went far beyond anything the laws of physics should have allowed. The claim was specific. In October 1943, at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, Navy scientists had supposedly installed powerful electromagnetic field generators aboard the vessel. Their stated goal was radar invisibility, using principles derived from Einstein's unified field theory. What happened next, according to the account, exceeded every worst-case scenario. What the scientists supposedly unleashed was teleportation. The Navy, the claim went, had accidentally moved a warship and its entire crew across 200 miles of open ocean in merely a matter of seconds. The crew had not survived the experience intact, and it would take 12 years for the story to surface and decades more to debunk it. When the generators were activated, the Eldridge was enveloped in a greenish fog. Observers on the dock watched the ship shimmer, blur, and then vanish completely from the waterfront. The berth was empty. The water where the destroyer had been sitting was undisturbed. A 300-foot warship with 200 men aboard had disappeared from the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in broad daylight. The Eldridge didn't merely vanish. She reappeared over 200 miles away in the harbor at Norfolk, Virginia, visible to stunned sailors for several minutes before vanishing again and returning to her original Philadelphia berth. The experiment hadn't just bent electromagnetic waves around the hull. According to the story, it had bent space itself. The crew paid the price. Some sailors were found fused into the metal structure of the ship, their bodies embedded in the steel hull, hands merged with bulkheads, legs grown into the deck plating. Others were on fire. Some had gone insane. A few seemed to flicker in and out of visibility for days afterward. Others disappeared entirely and were never seen again. These details were vivid, horrifying, and specific enough to fuel books, documentaries, and a Hollywood film for decades. But the question that mattered most wasn't whether the experiment had worked. It was whether the experiment had ever happened at all. The entire Philadelphia experiment traces back to one man. In 1955, a drifter named Carl M. Allen, who also went by the alias Carlos Miguel Allende, began writing letters to Morris K. Jessup, an astronomer who had recently published a book about UFOs. Allen claimed he had witnessed the Eldridge experiment firsthand from the deck of a nearby merchant vessel, the SS Andrew Furuseth. Allen's letters were erratic, cramped handwriting, random capitalization, obsessive underlining, shifts between first and third person. He offered no photographs, no documents, and no verifiable military credentials. His correspondence read like the work of someone deeply troubled, not someone with access to classified government programs. Then something unexpected happened. An annotated copy of Jessup's book arrived anonymously at the Office of Naval Research. its margins filled with handwritten notes in 3 different colored inks discussing UFOs and the Philadelphia experiment. The ONR identified the handwriting as Allen's and reproduced the annotated volume in a limited print run. That decision would prove more consequential than anything Allen had actually written. The Navy flatly denied everything. No invisibility experiment, no teleportation, no truth to any of it. The USS Eldridge's deck logs, preserved in the National Archives, contradicted the entire story. In October 1943, the month the experiment supposedly took place, the ship was being fitted out in New York and conducting shakedown cruises in the Western Atlantic. She was nowhere near Philadelphia. These logs are public record, available for anyone to examine. Decades later, researcher Jacques Vallée, a scientist with genuine credentials in investigating unexplained phenomena, published a rigorous 1994 analysis tracing the entire Philadelphia experiment back to Carl Allen's letters. His conclusion was unambiguous. The story was fabricated. There was not a single piece of corroborating evidence anywhere. The Greek Navy acquired the Eldridge in 1951 and renamed her Leon. She served without incident in the Aegean for decades. When Greek naval officials were asked about the ship's supposedly extraordinary history, they confirmed nothing unusual had ever been recorded. The vessel was exactly what her construction log said, an ordinary destroyer escort with an ordinary service record. But beneath all the fabrication, there was something real. The Navy had genuinely conducted degaussing experiments during the war, wrapping ship hulls in thick electrical cables to neutralize their magnetic signatures and protect against German mines. The technique worked and saved lives, but it made ships invisible only to magnetic detection equipment, not to the human eye. The distinction was everything. Einstein did briefly consult for the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance during wartime, working on explosive detonation physics. Combined with the secrecy surrounding degaussing and Einstein's actual involvement, Carl Allen had just enough raw material to construct an elaborate fiction. He took a mundane but classified technology and transformed it into something impossible. The thick cables humming with electricity around the hull, the secretive experiments, Einstein's name attached to real naval work, each element was genuine in isolation. But the leap from magnetic invisibility to optical invisibility and teleportation required nothing but imagination. Allen supplied the imagination. The facts supplied just enough scaffolding to make his lie feel plausible. Every piece of verifiable evidence pointed in the same direction. The deck logs disproved it. Vallée debunked it. The Navy denied it. The Greek Navy confirmed nothing unusual. The case should have been closed permanently. But in 1979, Charles Berlitz and William Moore published a best-selling book called The Philadelphia Experiment. A Hollywood film followed in 1984. Documentaries multiplied. The myth became more famous than the truth it contradicted. Why did the Office of Naval Research reproduce Allen's annotated book instead of discarding it? A drifter with no credentials and incoherent handwriting had sent them a marked-up paperback, and the ONR printed 100 copies of his marginalia. They never explained that decision. That silence, more than anything Allen ever wrote, kept the conspiracy breathing for decades. The Eldridge herself was sold to Greece and eventually scrapped. The ship is long gone, but the story has outlived the vessel by decades and shows no sign of fading. A debunked fabrication built from nothing but letters and imagination proved more durable than steel. The Philadelphia experiment left no physical evidence because almost certainly nothing happened. The real mystery was never about what occurred aboard the USS Eldridge. It was about why a fabrication built from a drifter's correspondence could outlast every piece of proof lined up against it. The deck logs are still in the National Archives. Almost nobody reads them. The Philadelphia experiment left no evidence because there was almost certainly nothing to leave behind. Just scattered letters, wartime gossip, and one man's imagination. But the next case was different. This one left something tangible. On a barren coral island in the Bahamas, a lighthouse still stands. Its door was found hanging open. Its light had gone dark, and the two men who had been keeping it had vanished without a trace. Great Isaac Cay sits roughly 50 miles northwest of Nassau, a barren coral outcrop barely large enough to anchor the structure that dominates it. The lighthouse was built there in 1859, rising 150 feet above the waterline to guide ships through one of the most treacherous stretches of the northern Bahamas. Without its light, vessels approaching the island chain from the Gulf Stream would be navigating blind through shallow reefs. The island itself offered nothing. No vegetation worth mentioning, no fresh water, no shelter beyond the lighthouse tower and a handful of low concrete buildings clustered at its base. Great Isaac existed for a single purpose: to hold that light above the waterline. Everything else on the island was there to keep two men alive long enough to do their jobs. For over a century, pairs of keepers rotated through shifts on the quay, maintaining the lamp, logging weather conditions, and enduring a level of isolation that few occupations demanded. Supply boats arrived on a fixed schedule. Between visits, the men had only each other and the open Atlantic. The two keepers assigned there in the summer of 1969 were experienced operators who had weathered previous storm seasons and understood exactly what the work required. They had survived bad weather before on Great Isaac, but the storm bearing down on the Bahamas in August 1969 would prove unlike anything the Cay had recently faced. The hurricane made direct impact. Winds exceeding 100 miles per hour tore across the island with nothing to slow them down. Waves surged over the rocks and flooded every structure at ground level. Great Isaac Cay had no natural defenses. No hills, no trees, no breakwater, just flat coral and the lighthouse itself, 150 feet of concrete and iron built to outlast exactly this kind of storm. The keeper's only refuge was the tower. When the weather finally passed and a relief boat reached the island, the crew found devastation at ground level. Windows shattered, equipment scattered across the rocks, seawater pooling in every room. But the lighthouse tower was still standing, damaged but structurally intact. Its door hung open. Its lamp was dark. The relief crew called out across the quay. Silence. Both keepers had vanished without a trace. The search of the island was quick. Great Isaac Cay is small enough to cover in less than an hour, and it turned up nothing. No wreckage on the rocks, no bodies floating in the shallows, no debris suggesting anyone had been swept away. No distress signal had ever been received from the lighthouse during the storm. Some personal belongings remained in the living quarters, waterlogged, but undisturbed. The men hadn't packed their things. They hadn't prepared to leave. There was no boat available for them to launch. The supply vessel was the only way on or off the island,
and it hadn't been there during the storm. The two keepers had simply disappeared, leaving no trace of how they had gone or where they had ended up.
The most logical explanation pointed to storm surge. A massive wave or series of waves could have swept both men off the exposed rocks and into the open sea, where survival in hurricane conditions would have been measured in minutes at most. Their bodies would have been carried far from the island by currents and lost to the deep. It was a reasonable conclusion. But the lighthouse had been built specifically to withstand hurricanes, and keepers were trained to shelter in the upper levels of the tower during severe weather. That was the tower's entire design purpose. If both men had been caught at ground level during the worst of the storm, something must have drawn them outside or forced them down from the safety of the tower before the surge arrived. What made two experienced keepers leave the one structure designed to protect them? No evidence answered that question. The storm could explain bodies lost at sea. It could not explain why trained professionals would abandon their shelter during a hurricane. The decision to go outside, if it was a decision at all, was the gap no investigation ever managed to bridge. Long before the keepers vanished, locals had spoken of a woman and her infant who drowned near the quay in a shipwreck during the 1800s. Her ghost, islanders claimed, walked the rocks at night, calling for her lost child. It was the kind of story every isolated lighthouse accumulated over the decades, a footnote of folklore that no one took seriously. After 1969, when two men disappeared from the same island under inexplicable circumstances, the legend took on a different weight entirely. The Bahamas Port Department automated the lighthouse shortly after the keepers vanished, installing equipment that required no human presence. The light still flashes on its solar-powered schedule, sending its beam across empty water every night. The island remains uninhabited. No formal investigation ever produced a conclusion about what happened to the two men. In over 50 years, no one has volunteered to go back. Their names have faded from operational records that tracked equipment and schedules, rather than the men who maintained them. What remains is the lighthouse, still standing, still flashing, still warning ships away from the reef. The tower survived the hurricane that took its keepers. It has survived every storm since. The quay stays empty, holding nothing but coral and silence, and a question that was never answered. Two men vanished from a lighthouse during a hurricane, and the island has stood empty ever since. A storm is a force of nature, blind, indiscriminate, without intent. But the next disaster was none of those things. It was calculated. It was deliberate. And it was carried out in the final days of a war that had already been decided, against people who were days away from liberation. On May 3, 1945, Europe's war had 5 days left. The Third Reich was collapsing from every direction. Soviet forces had taken Berlin. British and American armies were pushing through northern Germany, and the Nazi command structure was fragmenting into chaos. In Lübeck Bay on the Baltic coast, 3 ships sat at anchor. What was about to unfold would become one of the deadliest maritime disasters of the 20th century. The largest vessel was the Cap Arcona, a luxury ocean liner built in 1927 for the Hamburg South America line. She had once carried wealthy passengers on transatlantic crossings, her decks fitted with elegant dining rooms and polished woodwork.
By May 1945, all of that was gone. The Cap Arcona had been stripped down and repurposed for something her builders never intended. Alongside her sat the Thielbeck and the Deutschland, two smaller cargo vessels pressed into the same grim service. From the air, at altitude and speed, all three looked like ordinary German military ships. They carried no Red Cross insignia, no white flags, nothing to identify what they actually held inside.
As British forces approached, the SS faced a problem. Neuengamme concentration camp, one of the largest in northern Germany, still held thousands of prisoners. These were witnesses to atrocities the Nazi regime could not afford to have documented. The SS devised a solution of calculated brutality: load the surviving prisoners onto ships, sail them into the bay, and ensure the vessels were destroyed before the British arrived.
Approximately 4,500 prisoners from Neuengamme were crammed aboard the Cap Arcona. Most were emaciated, sick, and barely clinging to life after years of imprisonment. The Thielbeck held nearly 3,000 more. The Deutschland carried additional prisoners before most were redistributed between the other vessels. In total, over 7,000 people were trapped on these ships.
The SS made one final deliberate choice. The vessels carried no markings that might protect them, no Red Cross insignia, no identification as prisoner transports, nothing to signal to Allied pilots that civilians were aboard. To a British pilot diving at 300 miles per hour, the Cap Arcona was simply another enemy ship in a German port. The trap was set.
And the RAF flew directly into it. At approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, Typhoon fighter bombers from 83 Group of the Royal Air Force attacked the ships in Lübeck Bay. Armed with rockets and 20mm cannon, the Typhoons made repeated passes over the anchored vessels. The Cap Arcona took multiple direct hits. Her wooden superstructure, still lined with the elegant paneling of her passenger liner days, ignited immediately. Flames swept through the vessel from stem to stern as she began to list. Prisoners who escaped the burning holds plunged into the Baltic. The water temperature in early May was near freezing. Hypothermia would claim a swimmer in minutes. But even those who made it to the shallows found no safety. SS guards had positioned themselves along the shore with orders to shoot anyone who tried to land. Prisoners were machine-gunned in the water. Those who weren't shot drowned or burned. The Thielbeck sank rapidly, taking nearly her entire complement of prisoners with her, most still trapped below decks. The Cap Arcona burned, capsized, and settled in the shallow waters of the bay. The attack lasted less than an hour. When the Typhoons pulled away, the bay was burning. Thick black smoke rose from the capsized hull of the Cap Arcona. Oil slicks spread across the water's surface, some of them still on fire. The cries from the water carried to shore for hours afterward. The question that has defined this tragedy for 8 decades is whether the British knew what they were bombing. The Swedish Red Cross, under Count Folke Bernadotte, had been negotiating prisoner releases during the war's final weeks. Word had circulated through various channels that concentration camp prisoners were being held on ships in Lübeck Bay. The information existed. The question was whether it reached the men who pulled the trigger. The operational records from 83 Group, still held in the British National Archives, show that pilots were briefed to attack enemy shipping in the bay. No mention of prisoners aboard, no warning to hold fire.
But whether higher command possessed this intelligence and failed to pass it down through fractured communication chains remains fiercely contested.
The pilots saw enemy vessels to destroy. The prisoners saw their liberators arriving. Both were catastrophically wrong. The rockets that tore through the Cap Arcona's hull were fired by men who believed they were striking a legitimate military target. The prisoners died watching what they thought was rescue. The Cap Arcona bombing killed approximately 4,500 people. The Thielbeck went down with roughly 2,800 more. Combined, over 7,000 prisoners perished in Lübeck Bay that afternoon, a death toll exceeding the Titanic and the Lusitania together. Germany surrendered 5 days later. These prisoners were killed in the war's final hours, so close to liberation that some may have already heard approaching British tanks. The SS officers who orchestrated the death ships largely escaped specific prosecution. The war ended too abruptly. Records were destroyed in the fires meant to conceal everything. The chaos of Germany's collapse made accountability nearly impossible. The Cap Arcona's wreck still rests in the shallow waters of Lübeck Bay. Over the decades, divers have recovered human remains and personal effects from the site. The ship designed to erase evidence became evidence itself. Bodies washed ashore for weeks after the attack. Local fishermen pulled remains from their nets for months. The people of Neustadt, the nearest town, were ordered by British occupation forces to bury the dead, a task that took days and left mass graves along the coastline. Some of those graves remain unmarked to this day. Wilhelm Lang's 1988 book exposed the full scope of the tragedy for a German audience that had largely forgotten it. Memorials were eventually erected along the shore, but the Cap Arcona disaster never achieved the recognition of other wartime maritime catastrophes. A bombing that killed more people than the Titanic, carried out by Allied forces against concentration camp prisoners, fit no one's preferred version of history. Did the warning reach British command? Was it deliberately withheld from the pilots? Or did it simply arrive too late, lost in the fractured communication chains of those final chaotic days? The men who flew that mission carried the weight of what they had unknowingly done for the rest of their lives. Some eventually spoke about it. Most chose silence. The answer, if it exists, may still be classified. The Cap Arcona burned because of rockets and calculation and deliberate human cruelty. The ship, the prisoners, the fire, all documented, all traceable to decisions made by identifiable people. But the final case involves a different kind of fire entirely. This ship has no name, no crew, and no registry. It has been burning on the same stretch of water for over 200 years, and no one has ever explained what it is. The Northumberland Strait separates Prince Edward Island from Nova Scotia on Canada's eastern coast. It stretches roughly 200 kilometers and narrows to just 14 kilometers at its tightest point, with shallow waters rarely exceeding 60 meters deep. Fishing boats and ferries cross it daily. Since 1997, the Confederation Bridge has connected the island to the mainland. By every practical measure, it is one of the most ordinary bodies of water in North America. But for more than 200 years, people on both shores have reported seeing something on its surface that no bridge, no chart, and no scientific instrument has ever been able to explain. A ship, fully engulfed in flames,
burning on water where nothing is on fire. The sightings predate electricity. They predate photography. They predate any commercial or cultural incentive to fabricate a ghost story on a remote Canadian shoreline. And they continue to this day.
The Strait's maritime records are comprehensive, documenting centuries of vessels, voyages, and incidents since European settlement. Every shipwreck, every collision, every vessel lost to weather has been cataloged in archives stretching back to the colonial period. The record is thorough, and nowhere in it does any ship match the one that keeps appearing in flames. Witnesses describe a vessel with 3 or 4 masts, full sail, consumed by flames from bow to stern. The fire burns bright enough to illuminate the surrounding water. Sometimes the rigging is visible, ropes and canvas blazing against the night sky. Sometimes figures appear on deck, moving through the flames as though the fire isn't touching them. The vessel makes no sound. It sends no distress signal. It never approaches shore, regardless of wind or current. The ship burns for anywhere from minutes to over an hour, then simply vanishes. The flames collapse into darkness. The water goes still. Nothing remains. No wreckage, no ash, no smoke. The Strait returns to ordinary stillness as if nothing happened. And then, weeks or months later, the ship appears again. On multiple occasions, local fishing crews have launched rescue boats toward the burning vessel, believing they were approaching a ship in genuine distress. As they drew closer, the fire receded, not extinguishing, but retreating, as if deliberately maintaining distance. Once the crews abandoned pursuit, the flames lingered on the horizon. These accounts aren't folklore or tavern tales. Canadian Coast Guard officers on both sides of the strait have filed formal reports about the phenomenon. Tourists have photographed anomalous lights on the water. Local newspapers dating back to the 1700s have documented eyewitness testimonies from communities along the entire length of the coastline. The sightings span centuries, recorded consistently since the 1780s in sources that can still be verified today. What makes dismissing these reports difficult is the consistency across independent observers. On multiple occasions, witnesses at different points along the strait, separated by miles of coastline, have reported seeing the same burning vessel on the same night. Some had never heard the legend beforehand, yet they described the exact same thing: a tall ship engulfed in silent flame, burning on water where nothing was actually on fire, matching descriptions recorded 2 centuries earlier. The phenomenon was documented before anyone had reason to invent it, before electric lights could be mistaken for phantom fires, before the concept of ghost ships had entered popular culture. These were farmers, fishermen, and lighthouse keepers, people with practical concerns and no audience for tall tales, writing down what they saw on the water. In 1967, the Journal of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada published an analysis suggesting atmospheric refraction as the leading explanation. Temperature inversions over the cold water could create optical illusions. A distant fishing boat's lantern might appear magnified and distorted into what looked like a burning ship. Other researchers proposed bioluminescence from disturbed marine organisms, or St. Elmo's fire from electrical discharge during certain atmospheric conditions. Each theory accounted for phantom lights in general. None of them explained why these particular lights consistently manifested as a 3-masted sailing vessel with visible crew members moving across its deck. Atmospheric refraction could produce distorted lights.
It could not produce a ship with identifiable rigging and human figures. The gap between what physics could explain and what hundreds of witnesses had actually described remained wide open.
Multiple explanations existed. None was sufficient. The fireship occupied a space between observable fact and scientific impossibility, too consistently witnessed to dismiss, too physically inexplicable to confirm. The phenomenon simply continued, year after year, century after century, indifferent to every attempt at explanation.
And here was the deeper problem. Every ghost ship legend in maritime history traces back to a real vessel, a ship with a name, a registry, a crew manifest, and a documented disaster. The Flying Dutchman has the Dutch East India Company. The Mary Celeste has the Gibraltar Inquiry. But the Northumberland Strait fireship has no origin. No recorded shipwreck in the strait matches the Phantom. No maritime disaster, no fire, no ship. Unlike every other spectral vessel in the historical record, this one was never built, never crewed, never sailed, and never burned. It exists only in the act of being witnessed, a vessel with no history and no identity, burning in a fire that never happened. Yet hundreds of people across 3 centuries have stood on shore and watched it burn. This is what separates the Northumberland fireship from every other maritime phantom. There is nothing behind it. No disaster, no origin story, no wreck on the bottom. It is a ghost without a source, a fire without fuel, on water that has never burned. The strait freezes each winter. The sightings resume when the ice melts, as they have every spring for as long as anyone can remember. Museums and local archives have preserved accounts spanning 300 years. Even now, in the age of satellites, radar, and infrared imaging, ordinary residents and ferry passengers continue reporting the exact same phenomenon that witnesses described in the 1780s. The fireship hasn't changed. It is still burning. No one knows what it is. 4 stories, 4 different kinds of evidence. The Philadelphia experiment left nothing behind because almost certainly nothing happened. Just one man's letters, an inexplicable Navy decision to preserve them, and a myth that outlived the ship it was built around. The USS Eldridge's deck logs sit in the National Archives, available to anyone. The hoax remains more famous than the truth. The legend outlived the steel. On Great Isaac Cay, the evidence is physical. The lighthouse still stands. The light still flashes. The island is still empty. 2 men vanished during a hurricane over 50 years ago, and no investigation ever produced an answer. The structure designed to protect them survived everything. They did not. In Lubeck Bay, the Cap Arcona rests in shallow water, a luxury liner turned death ship, bombed by the forces that were supposed to liberate the prisoners trapped aboard. Over 7,000 people died 5 days before the war ended because a warning either wasn't sent, wasn't received, or wasn't passed down. The wreck is still there. Bones are still surfacing. And on the Northumberland Strait, a ship with no name, no registry, and no recorded history has been burning on the water since before anyone alive today was born. The deck logs prove the Eldridge never vanished. The fireship proves that something doesn't need to have ever existed to refuse to disappear. One mystery has too much evidence. The other has none at all. Neither one has been solved.